Welcome to CDR Horizons, a new series from OpenAir hosted by Charles and myself, Harsh, in which we engage leading researchers about novel carbon removal technologies and ideas that they're developing. CDR Horizons will explore the future of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, and we're excited to have you on this journey with us.
In this episode, we speak with Stephanie Arcusa, a postdoc at Arizona State University. We chat about issues with today's carbon markets and standards, and Stephanie shares her work on developing a new framework for durable carbon removal crediting. It's definitely a more abstract episode focused on the policies, regulations, and standards around carbon removal, but all of these are critical in shaping the development of durable carbon removal technology and for ensuring future climate justice and equity. If you're interested in following breaking carbon capture research, definitely like and subscribe to our channel for more content. And now, onto the show.
So today I will share a vision of a framework for the certification of carbon sequestration. This is work that has been done in collaboration between the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at Arizona State University and a multi-stakeholder partnership. So to provide some context, I think we will all agree that the emerging carbon dioxide removal industry really needs standards to ensure safety and the performance of its activities. To borrow words from Dr. Peter Miner from Carbon 180, we really are trying to convince the public that CO2, which is an odorless and colorless gas, is being moved from the atmosphere into storage, which is essentially a black box. This is a lot of trust that we're asking from the consumers, from the public, the government, the investors. But one really cool thing is that certification really can provide us the tool to create this trust. So certification schemes are really keeping the world running, and they will also support the carbon dioxide industry. Where are we now? We are in a very complex and rapidly evolving ecosystem of standard developing organizations creating protocols to certify carbon sequestration of all sorts. We've identified over 20 organizations that certify over 40 different types of CDR removal in 6 main reservoirs. And all of these protocols are really different. Work from Carbon Plan on soil sequestration found that the different protocols that exist are really different in terms of the rigorousness of their measurements, in terms of the treatment of the durability, in terms of safety, and so on. So there's really a lot of disparity between all of the different protocols, so much so that we need buyers' guidance in order to guide the consumer in their purchases and guide the consumer in their assessment of quality. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that it is unfair. It's an unfair burden to place on buyers. It's a burden that cannot be met because the buyer cannot conceivably verify their purchases. So that means that in order to get a certain level of quality, we need to start shifting the responsibility onto the certification schemes, onto the certifier to ensure quality from the get-go. And to us, this means that we need to focus on the accounting protocols. Right now, the protocols are based on what was used for emission avoidance and reduction, which are based on counterfactuals. But counterfactuals are not verifiable. The benefit or the advantage, I guess, of carbon dioxide removal is that we can actually measure directly the removal, and direct measurements are verifiable. So up to now, certification has really been focusing on incentivizing low carbon projects or reductions in emissions and so on. But we're trying to really shift the conversation onto providing this supporting infrastructure that would enable the compensation of the service of carbon removal. And this is so that we can create a business that is long lasting, as long as we actually need it to be, which is quite long term. And this is not something that is new or controversial. Carbon dioxide removal is an activity that needs to be done long term. And what is meant by that is that the carbon that is being removed from the atmosphere into storage needs to be kept away from the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years, because that is the amount of time that carbon in the atmosphere will cause damage. So one way to think about this is to match the sequestration duration to the damage function of the part of the climate system that we're trying to protect. If we're trying to protect from temperature, then we need to have sequestration that lasts for thousands of years to match the ocean uptake. If we want to protect from the ocean acidification, then we need tens of thousands of years to match the uptake from mineralization and weathering and so on. So we can try to shift the conversation to defining durable storage to mean that that duration of time that will protect the climate system, given a certain amount of carbon release that can be agreed beforehand. So in that context, we really have to start recognizing, I guess, that 100 years or less is woefully too short. And it's too short because we simply would push the climate change problem onto the next generation, who will not have the wealth nor the technology probably to deal with it. And the other side of the coin is that we probably can all agree that the polluter or the producer of carbon dioxide really ought to pay for the disposal, for the removal. And if we start to push, or if we start to define carbon sequestration durability as 100 years, then we're kind of creating a gap between the potential for the polluter to pay again once the carbon comes out. Obviously, if we define durability as 10,000 years, it's equally difficult. But so what it really means is that we need to rethink how we are going to implement this. And then the last part is that to meet the needs that we have today of reducing the overshoot, we really have to start sequestration today. And sequestration can start today using short-term reservoirs. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're incredibly important. But for the reasons I mentioned above, the polluter pays principle and the intergenerational equity principle, we cannot allow them to violate those. So the final piece is that we will be needing all sorts of built-in natural reservoirs, and all of those need to be treated on an equal footing. So what we are offering really is a vision or a set of guidelines that can be used to develop standards that will certify the sequestration of carbon in any suitable built and natural reservoirs that can guarantee safety and performance, and also allows acting today, but without compromising the future. But what does this mean in practice? It means having those guidelines for suitable built natural reservoirs. And what we think those means are that they do not harm the environment from the addition or loss of carbon, that they can have their boundaries identified, that they do not have such massive fluctuations that the carbon content cannot be determined, and that they do not fill spontaneously, for example, due to connections to other reservoirs. It also means designing evidence-based accounting protocols. All reservoirs and all carbon dioxide removal approaches will need their own protocol and their own equipment. But all of the protocols, they really ought to have or meet certain requirements. And we think there are three of those. The first one is that the protocol must include a method to delineate the boundaries of the reservoir. The second one is that there must be a method to quantify the additions and the subtractions from the reservoir. And the third one is that there must be a method to quantify the carbon content of the reservoir on demand. This does not need to be instantaneous, obviously, but we need to be able to know how much carbon is in the reservoir. And finally, all of these measurements must be made with some agreed level of certainty. And then what our framework is really saying is that we want to focus on responsibility as the common denominator across all of the different reservoirs. Up to now, the responsibility has been on the buyer to repurchase when the carbon sequestration ends. What we want to say is that now the responsibility ought to shift onto the storage operator. And this is very simple. This just means that the storage operator needs to include in their business plan the monitoring and resequestration of carbon. So very simply, monitoring means that all reservoirs have to be continuously monitored. It has to be evidence-based and flexible in its frequency, depending on the carbon reservoir. And eventually, the continuous monitoring can decrease in the frequency if monitoring never finds a change in the content. Eventually, then storage could be considered durable. All other storage types will need to continue this continuous monitoring, and every time there is a loss of carbon, there needs to be resequestration. Resequestration is very easy. It's either resequestering within the same system, or it's just purchasing sequestration from some other system. And together, this kind of framework is offering kind of a solution to support carbon dioxide removal as a service industry in a way that does allow for action taken today, but without compromising the future. And all of this based on evidence. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, for that presentation and walking us through some of your most recent work. So I guess we always like to start off with a little bit of a personal question. Just how did you get into carbon removal? Like, what was your kind of journey, and how did you kind of find yourself in this field?
Yeah. So I actually started as a paleoclimatologist, which means I study the climate of the Earth through its history. And so there was a lot of focus on geology, obviously, and the natural environment. And as I was going through my studies, I really kind of realized that I couldn't just observe the climate system anymore. I had to shift to climate mitigation. And Dr. Klaus Lackner at Arizona State University had this collaborative project going on with with Conservation International on the certification of carbon removal. And it just felt like the perfect blend of paleoclimatology, geology, but also climate mitigation. And that's how I fell into it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool to hear your background. I haven't met many paleoclimatologists before, and it's cool to hear that kind of your observations of the past kind of drew you to start thinking about the future.
Yeah.
Carbon dioxide removal and just carbon credits is certainly a big industry. And as you mentioned, a lot of that has evolved from the big incumbents who used to do avoidance. How do these like new methodologies or any changes kind of fit into what a Vera or gold standard or someone else will do? Is this something we hope the big incumbents will adopt? Is this an alternative to them? Do the incumbents want to adopt this, right? Because they differentiate right now based on how unique their methodologies are.
Yeah, good question. So one of the main kind of observations I have, and I think is shared by a lot of people, is that it really feels like we've run out of time, and we need some kind of a system yesterday. And so to me, it seems like these incumbents have done decades of work already. They've put in an infrastructure in place. So to me, it would make sense that to catalyze the development of the carbon dioxide industry, we actually need everybody's help. So then to me, my biggest kind of hope is that this can be a framework that can be adopted by everyone. And it would mean maybe reviewing different protocols and kind of adjusting and making sure it's meeting the criteria. And obviously, some of them will not. That's the name of the game, I guess. But I think there is a distinction to be made between what is a protocol for emission reduction or emission avoidance and what is a protocol for emission removal. And I think maybe that's where a split could be made and be convincingly supported by scientific evidence that they are not the same.
And kind of going off of that, you talked about like I guess the vision and kind of the ecosystem and where it is now. But I guess concretely, like what are y'all's kind of next steps? Like you're working on developing this framework, and where are you guys kind of right now? Are you in conversation with different groups, or are you working on getting funding to start your own thing, or trying to find more partners and stakeholders?
Yeah, we're definitely trying to find partners and stakeholders. I think this is a game that really needs a lot of players and a lot of and a lot of disciplines, right? There's going to be a lot of work to be done on really pinpointing what are those measurements that are rigorous for each of those reservoirs, and that is going to take a lot of experts in each of those reservoirs. It's going to take a lot of people who have a lot of expertise in implementing this on the ground and developing those business plans and business practices. So there is a lot of work to be done. We are looking for partners in this endeavor. I think probably in the short term, unless somebody steps in and wants to directly support this kind of accreditation system, this is something that we might start doing by ourselves.
Got it. And I mean, just maybe jumping off, right? Like when your conversations with partners are happening, do you usually see people being perceptive to this new protocol? Or I think from what I've seen, right, like when there's more strictness, like a more stringent way of doing things, like people just get lazy and there's like a curve you have to get them over. It's kind of been your reaction right now.
Yeah, that's a funny observation. So we do think that we offer simplicity, actually, because the requirements have really been like honed to be the most essential ones. So we are not saying anything that cannot be done through direct measurement. So yes, some sequestration approaches, are not quite developed. We don't know much about the system, but that just means we need more research to actually know our system and, refine our methods. So that's going to take some work. And I think there's a lot to be said about that simplicity of having direct measurements and not relying on counterfactuals, which are inherently impossible to verify. So there is that building of credibility once we can get that going. The one aspect that seems to be the sticking point, much more than the direct measurement part, is that long-term kind of aspect of carbon dioxide removal. It's becoming more and more obvious that durability is actually an externality that neither the seller nor the buyer wants to fix. And so this means there's going to need some regulation in order to make this possible. Having said that, if we are really trying to create a service industry rather than something that we can do quickly, there is going to need to be a sustainable business practice. People are going to want to be paid for taking on the liability of all that storage. And to be paid to take on the liability, it cannot be 50 cents a ton. It has to be the required amount for the amount of work that it's going to take. And so this is a way to also protect the storage operators in this endeavor. So we do feel like there's a lot of benefits to having this different kind of framework. At the end of the day, the polluter has to pay for the disposal, the cleanup of their mess, and this has to be the actual price. So yeah, there are challenges, but also a lot of benefits.
Yeah, and I really like the point about simplicity. I feel like that also kind of removes the black box of what's driving the credit. So it's much easier to hold people accountable, where you're not like lost behind like methodology 522 and you have no way to hold people accountable.
I was just going to add on like the stuff about liability. That's like really complicated. Like we've never thought about liability of like 100-year, 1,000-year tons. It's like almost mind boggling just to think about. And that I don't, yeah, that sounds like a very sticky problem of how to, like, who has that blame and liability, but perhaps it is something that is ultimately in the hands of the public good that is benefiting, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. The one thing I will say, I guess, that kind of counteracts that is that the public never asked for this.
Yeah.
It is the storage operator that decides to do this activity and then puts that potential impact on the environment and pushes it onto the public. So to me, that seems like an unfair an unfair attribution of liability to the public for an activity that was privatized.
Just jumping off this, I'm wondering, like, do we need some policy changes? Because when you talk about permanence, right, I know most credits are 100 years, maybe like a little bit more if you're looking at some of the niche ones. But then you have like gases like HCFs and a lot of other gases that are 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years in the atmosphere. And like this at some level, right? Like, I don't think customers would want to pay more for like more permanent credits. Like, does it have to be a government that comes in and says, no, your credit has to like be valid over 5,000 years instead of 100?
Yeah, I think there is a role to play for the government or nation states in general. I think maybe if we shift away from assigning like a specific time and we just kind of all agree that this is something that has to be done in perpetuity, then we can start moving towards having continuous monitoring. We can say you monitor continuously. The end of monitoring can happen if after, 50 years, the monitoring finds the carbon has not moved whatsoever. You've never had to resequester anything. Let's say after 50 years, because that's manageable. Maybe after that, we pass on the contract to a nation state that is willing to take on the contract. And then they continue monitoring until, the monitoring intervals are so wide that there's no point checking anymore. But for any sort of sequestration where the monitoring finds that the carbon is coming out and there's resequestration needed all the time, then we can continue and do this, but we just have to resequester. And this can just be implemented within the business practice from the beginning. If I'm a storage operator and I know that my reservoir is leaky, that's fine. I just need to make my business plan with that in mind, that I have to continuously monitor and resequester. And then we can start, transitioning slowly but surely towards all durable storage. Because at the end of the day, it's only with durable storage that we can end the responsibility of taking care of the polluter pays principle.
Yeah, I know in a lot of other business models that deal with liability and failure, some businesses essentially accept failure and guarantee their customer that they replace whatever fails. I'm thinking like, cloud computing, but that's kind of a different example. That's just based on the general principle of modularity. But it's an interesting trade-off because we do need ultimately like a serious amount of permanence for carbon storage. Really interesting to think about all these, I guess, policy questions that are perhaps under discussed in the more commercialized side or private VC side, where everyone is trying to jump into the market. But there is also a place for thoughtful discussion on how exactly these markets should be operating and what regulations should guide them. I wanted to switch a little bit and ask, so you've discussed like these kind of high level principles, but we know carbon removal is a very diverse set of technologies and geologies. Like geological sequestration is like literally, the opposite of ocean sequestration. They have so many differences. How do you see specific proposals and methodologies based on your principles being developed in terms of, do you all want to be the developers of those new proposals, or are you simply setting out a framework or a bunch of principles that other groups can then adopt to their more specific, I guess, market or regulatory side?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're envisioning those principles as kind of the minimum requirements for any protocol. If a protocol that has been devised for ocean sequestration or for geologic sequestration meets those requirements, then at the very minimum, they are doing what they ought to be doing. And unfortunately, that means meeting all of the requirements because there are so few, right? Now, if it's this very specific type of sequestration, that's fine. The protocols just need to meet those requirements and then add whatever is necessary for it to work. Now, it really seems like to implement such a framework, there needs to be an accreditation process where a protocol can be designed by anybody to try to meet those requirements. Then somebody goes through the protocol and just makes sure that it's actually meeting the requirements and will actually work. And then they get kind of a stamp of approval. And then the protocol can be used by whoever designed it as needed for their own system. Obviously, this framework is really only focusing on carbon because that was the goal. Carbon is a very specific beast. It remains in the atmosphere, forever. So it needs very tailored approaches. But if somebody wanted to also quantify the co-benefits or quantify some other greenhouse gases, then obviously that can be tagged along by other certification schemes. But at the core, if this is going to be creating carbon sequestration, we think it ought to meet these minimal level of requirements.
Yeah. The one thought, when you talk about certification, one of your core principles was something that's, quantifiable and measurable. I'm wondering, does that influence the kinds of CDR that might qualify better, right? Like trees versus direct air capture. Does the measurability or quantifiability of a technology make it more favorable, or how do you kind of view the different CDR technologies or methods?
Yeah, I think certain methods right now have the benefit of history. So there has been a long, line of research on geologic sequestration and on forestry. So by now, the methods to measure carbon in those reservoirs is well advanced. We really understand the system. Yes, there are some very important differences, like the fluctuations in the forest, but by now we understand how it works. So I think it's more a question of having the targeted research in order to really know what's going on. I think right now, just to give an example, there's a lot of, attempts to design a protocol for soil carbon enhancement, but maybe the research hasn't really gotten to the point where we really know how the system really works. And so maybe we actually just need to increase research funding and make sure we actually know what's going on there. One sequestration method that really deserves a lot more research before we do anything is ocean sequestration. And there, I think the issue of not having a clear boundary for where the carbon is going to go is really an issue. However, can we solve this with more research? Maybe we can start becoming very clever about knowing where the carbon can move and infiltrate. So I don't think, I think it should definitely be a process of going through each system and make sure we have the understanding we need. And maybe one day we'll find that some systems are just not well suited for this kind of work. And maybe that needs to be okay.
Yeah, the I think balance between just going for it and solidifying our research before we invest resources. It's very tricky, I think, especially right now when there are so many ideas and so much capital to chase it. You kind of don't want to leave any idea on the table. And there's also urgency, right? So it's I guess a tricky trade-off between waiting for the research and just going for it, given the urgency of the topic.
And I guess to close out, how we've talked a lot about all the different policy implications and the regulatory side and market side and certification, but how can open air as kind of a community of policy advocates and open source researchers kind of help you in your work?
Yeah. So what we're really interested about is to pilot this framework on real world examples with real sequestration projects. So we're really looking for projects that maybe have started already, but would like to do some investigative kind of research, I guess, and see if we can try to implement the framework in all of its forms and to see if it even works, to try and pinpoint where are the problems, where is it not working as intended. So I think this is where maybe the power of open air really could be really influential in moving forward what we think is probably one of the simplest but also the fairest frameworks for the certification of carbon sequestration.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely put the call out.
Awesome.
No pressure to the open air community.
Yeah, well, it was great having you on, Stephanie, and thanks for chatting with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and being able to articulate some of this vision that we have.